but because the intellectual substance by its operation reaches out to God, not only by understanding, but also by an act of the will, by desiring and loving Him and having delight in Him. It may seem to some that the ultimate end and the ultimate happiness of man is not in knowing God, but rather in by loving, or by some other act of the will, having oneself towards Him, especially when the object of the will is good, which has the aspect of an end. But truth, which is the object of the understanding, has no aspect of end, except in so far as it is itself good. Hence man does not seem to attain the ultimate end by an act of the intellect, but rather by an act of the will. In addition, the ultimate perfection of activity is pleasure, which completes activity like beauty and youth, as in 10 Ethics says the philosopher. If therefore perfect operation is the last end, it seems that the last end is more according to the operation of the will than of the intellect. Still, pleasure seems to be so desired for its own sake as never for any other reason, for it is foolish to ask anyone why he wants to be pleased. Now this is the condition of the last end, namely, that it be sought for its own sake. The last end, therefore, seems to be more in the operation of the will than of the intellect. Again, in the desire for the ultimate end, all are mostly agreed, since it is natural, but many seek pleasure rather than knowledge. It seems then that pleasure is more the goal than knowledge. Further, the will seems to be a higher power than the intellect, for the will moves the intellect to its act, for the intellect actually considers what it holds to habit when one wills. Therefore, the action of the will seems more noble than the action of the intellect. It seems, therefore, that the last end, which is happiness, consists more in the act of the will than in the act of the intellect. But this is clearly shown to be impossible, for since happiness is the proper good of the intellectual nature, it must correspond to that which is proper to the intellectual nature. Appetite, however, is not a property of the intellectual nature, but is present in all things, although it may be in different ways in different people. This diversity, however, proceeds from the fact that things are related to knowledge in different ways, for those who are completely devoid of knowledge have only a natural appetite, but they have sensitive knowledge, and they have a sensible appetite, under which is contained the irascible and the concupiscible. But those things have intellectual knowledge, and they have an appetite proportional to knowledge, that is, the will. The will, therefore, insofar as it is appetite, is not a property of the intellectual nature, but only insofar as it depends on the understanding. But the understanding in itself is proper to the intellectual nature. Still, in all powers which are moved by their objects, the objects are naturally prior to the acts of those powers, just as the mover is naturally prior to the mover itself. But such a power is the will, for the appetitive moves the appetite. Therefore the object of the will is naturally prior to its act. His first object, therefore, precedes every act of his. Therefore the act of the will cannot be first willed. And this is the last end, which is happiness. It is therefore impossible that happiness or happiness is itself an act of the will. In addition, in all powers which can be converted into their own acts, it is first necessary that the act of that power be brought into another object, and afterwards into its own act. For if the intellect understands itself to understand, it must first be posited that it understands something, and consequently that it understands itself to understand. For the very understanding that the intellect understands is of some object, whence it must either proceed to infinity, or, if it is to arrive at the first understanding, this will not be the understanding itself, but some intelligible thing. Similarly, it is necessary that the first will is not to will itself, but some other good. But the first will of the intellectual nature is happiness, or happiness itself. For because of this, we will whatever we will. It is therefore impossible for happiness to consist essentially in an act of the will. Further, each thing has the truth of its nature according to those things which constitute its substance. For the real man differs from the image in those things which constitute the substance of man. But true happiness does not differ from false happiness according to the act of the will. For the will is in the same way in desiring, loving, or delighting whatever it is that is proposed to it as the highest good, whether truly or falsely. But whether it is really the supreme good which is proposed as such or falsely, this differs from the part of the understanding. Therefore, happiness, or happiness, consists essentially in the understanding rather than in the act of the will. Again, if happiness itself were an act of the will, this act would be either to desire, or to love, or to be pleased. But it is impossible to miss the last end, for there is desire according to which the will tends to that which it does not yet have. But this is contrary to the reason of the ultimate end. Love also cannot be the ultimate goal, for a good is loved not only when it is possessed, but also when it is not possessed. For it is from love that the possession is not sought by desire. And if love is more perfect than that which is already possessed, this is caused by the fact that the good is deemed loved. It's a different thing, then, to have a good which is the end, than to love, which before to have is imperfect, but after to have is perfect. Similarly, neither is pleasure the last end, for to have the good itself is the cause of delight, or while we now feel that the attitude is good, or while the former attitude is mentioned, or while we hope to have it in the future. Therefore, pleasure is not the ultimate goal. Therefore, no act of the will can be substantially itself happiness. Still, if pleasure were the last end, it would be desirable in itself. But this is false, for it depends on what pleasure is desired from that to which the pleasure results. For the pleasure that results from good and desirable operations is good and desirable, but what is bad, bad, and to be avoided. Therefore it has to be good and to be desired from another. Therefore it is not the final end itself, which is happiness. Still, the right order of things agrees with the order of nature, for natural things are ordered to their end without error. But in the natural there is pleasure because of the operation, and not the other way around. For we see that nature has attached pleasure to those activities of animals which are clearly directed to necessary ends, as in the use of food, which is directed to the preservation of the individual, and in the use of sexual intercourse, which is directed to the preservation of the species. It is therefore impossible that pleasure should be the last end. Again, delight seems to be nothing else than the quieting of the will in some suitable good, just as desire is the inclination of the will to achieve some good. But just as man is inclined by the will to an end and rests in it, so natural bodies have natural inclinations towards their proper ends, which are indeed stilled when they reach the end. But it is ridiculous to say that the end of the movement of a heavy body is not to be in its proper place, but the quieting of the tendency towards which it tended. For if nature had principally intended this, that the inclination should be quieted, she would not have given it. And he gives it, that by this means it may tend to its own place. After which, as if at an end, follows the stilling of the inclination. And so such a rest is not an end, but an accompanying end, nor then is pleasure the last end, but a concomitant of it. Still, if some thing is the external end of a thing, that operation of it is also said to be the ultimate end by which it first attains that thing. Just as to those whose end is money, the end is also said to be to possess money, but not to love, nor to covet. But the last end of the intellectual substance is God. That activity of man, then, is substantially his happiness or happiness, through which he first reaches God. Now this is to understand, for we cannot will what we do not understand. Therefore, man's ultimate happiness is in knowing God substantially through the intellect, not in an act of the will. Now therefore, by what has been said, the solution to the contrary of the objections is clear. For if happiness is the object of the will, by virtue of the fact that it has the aspect of the highest good, it is therefore necessary that it be substantially the act of the will itself, as the first reason proceeded. Rather, from this very fact that it is the first object, it follows that it is not its act, as appears from what has been said. It is also not necessary that everything by which a thing is accomplished in whatever way is the end of that thing, as the second reason proceeded. For something is the perfection of something in two ways. In one way, as having already a species; in another way, in order to have a species. Just as the perfection of a house, in so far as it already has a species, is that to which the species of a house is directed, namely a habitation, for a house would not be made except for this. Hence this must also be put in the definition of a house, if the definition is to be complete. Now the perfection of the species of a house is that which is ordered to establish the species, as well as its substantial principles. Then that which is directed to the preservation of the species, like the supports which are made for the maintenance of a house. Then also those which make the use of the house more convenient, such as the beauty of the house. Therefore, that which is the perfection of a thing according as it already has its form, is its end, as a dwelling is the end of a house. And likewise the proper operation of anything, which is as it were its use, is its end. But what are the perfections of a thing in appearance are not the end of the thing. On the contrary, the thing is the end of itself. For matter and form are for the sake of appearance. For although form is the end of generation, it is not the end of that which has already been generated and has a species. In the same way, the preservation of the thing in its kind, such as health and nutritive power, although they complete the animal, are not the end of the animal, but rather the other way around. Those also to which a thing is adapted to complete the proper operations of the species, and to achieve the due end more congruently, are not the end of the thing, but rather on the contrary. As the beauty of man, and the strength of the body, and other things of this kind, of which the philosopher says, in the first chapter of the Ethics, that they organically serve happiness. But enjoyment is the perfection of an operation, not so that the operation is ordered to it according to its species, but is ordered to other ends. Just as eating is ordered according to its species to the preservation of the individual. But it is similar to perfection, which is ordered to the species of the thing. For because of pleasure we insist more attentively and decently on the activity in which we delight. Whence the philosopher says in 10 of Ethics that but it is like a perfection which is directed to the appearance of a thing. For because of pleasure we insist more attentively and decently on the activity in which we delight. Whence the philosopher says in 10 of Ethics that but it is like a perfection which is directed to the appearance of a thing. For because of pleasure we insist more attentively and decently on the activity in which we delight. Whence the philosopher says in 10 of Ethics that pleasure completes the operation, as beauty accomplishes youth, which indeed is because of him in whom youth is present, and not the other way around. nor is the fact that men desire pleasure not for another's sake, but for their own sake, a sufficient sign that pleasure is the last end. As the third reason concluded, for pleasure, even if it is not the ultimate end, is nevertheless accompanying the ultimate end, when pleasure arises from the attainment of the end. But not many seek the pleasure which is in knowing, rather than knowledge. But there are more who seek the pleasures of the senses than the knowledge of the intellect and the consequent pleasure itself. But what the fifth reason proposes, that the will is superior to the understanding, as if it were its motive, is manifestly false. For the intellect first and by itself moves the will. For the will as such is moved by its object, which is good apprehended. Now the will moves the intellect as if by accident, inasmuch as understanding itself is apprehended as good, and is thus desired by the will, from which it follows that the intellect actually understands. And in this very thing the intellect precedes the will, for the will would never desire to understand unless the intellect first apprehended understanding itself as good. And again, the will moves the intellect to work in the act in the manner in which the agent is said to move. But the understanding moves the will in the manner in which the end moves it, for the good understanding is the end of the will. But the agent is later in moving than the end, for the agent does not move except for the sake of the end. Hence it appears that the understanding is simply superior to the will, but the will is incidental to the understanding, and as such